Hello everyone, and welcome to Same Old News with your host, Josh. Episode 2, The State of Present Day News. Hello once again, and welcome to Same Old News, the show that dissects and analyses the news, both past and present, and tries to find links between the two. Now, before we start, I do apologise for the wait time in between episodes. Juggling time between this podcast project, my PhD, and trying to have some semblance of a social life and sanity out here in Australia has proved to be rather challenging. Also, in the last couple of days, I have been very much glued to the screen looking at the local elections going on in the UK. For me, I was seeing if my vote was counting for the elections that I was voting in for the London Mayor and London Assembly. And I was also looking at what news coverage was picking up on and arguing in their analysis of the results that are still coming in as I am recording. But enough about my time management problems. Let's get into today's episode on how people and I see the state of present day / modern news. I don't like to use the term modern. I feel it doesn't actually achieve anything and has many issues with geographical and ideological differences on ideas of modernity and what that even means. So we'll just say present day to stop myself from having an existential crisis mid-episode. The press and news media in the present day is suffering a bit of a legitimacy problem. It is widely seen as untrustworthy, mainly through the argument of media bias. After doing some scouring of polling data from the past 5 or so years, do find those sources in the description of this episode, we see a general trend of lack of trust in the media and the press. In 2023, Ipsos Mori conducted a poll in the UK which saw only 21% of respondents saying they trust journalists, contrasting that with the Edelman Trust Barometer report in 2023 that saw 31% of UK respondents saying that they trusted the media in general. Now, this is not a new phenomenon, born out of the pandemic either. Pew Research Centre's 2018 research polling saw 2/3 of UK respondents say that they did not trust news media in general. But this is then contrasted by data which argues that this trust dynamic changes across media organisations and formats. In the very same poll data, 79% of respondents said that they trusted the government-regulated BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, and 74% trusted ITV. But this then dropped when you got to newspapers, 50% for The Guardian, 49% for The Times, and then 30% for the Daily Mail. This issue of newspaper trust being low is best reflected in the declining circulation of newspapers. The Audit Bureau of Circulations keeps on top of these figures and has reported that circulation is consistently declining, at least from my research in the UK. Now, this data is inconsistent as it has up-to-date data on some newspapers, while others there are no figures after 2020. So I took data from popular newspapers in the UK across the political spectrum. On the political left you have The Guardian, whose circulation has dropped from 164,000 in 2016 to 108,000 in 2021, which was the last year that we have a figure reported. This is then contrasted on the political right, where you have the Daily Mail, which has seen figures fall from 1,589,000 in 2016 to 735,000 in 2024, a more than 50% loss in loyal readers. But of all these polling data and information and statistics and numbers that I found, the one which I found the most interesting was the statistic from Pew Research, which was the growth of informal media in the form of social media, with 55% of respondents saying that they get news from social media sources, most of those being under the age of 30. Does this signal a change in trust away from established news media corporations towards social media among the younger generations? And is this a trend that will continue into the upcoming generation? Certainly, that question is far too early to give a really concrete answer to. However, we can throw data and statistics at this episode for hours on end, and we will get absolutely nowhere, because those numbers don't actually tell us much. Just yeses and nos, and it doesn't actually explain why those people stopped reading a certain newspaper or chose a new media format. They don't account for the nuance in people's opinions on these topics, especially with anything to do with politics. So, I decided to call a few favours and went out to interview people and get more full answers to these questions, rather than asking for yeses and nos and I don't knows. Now, these interviews are going to be used for the next few episodes, while we break down the key themes that I want to focus on in this series, so you are going to be getting to know these voices quite well over the next few episodes. Also, many of them do not have professional microphones, as you are going to hear, so you are going to hear varying audio quality over the next few episodes, and I apologise in advance for that. Anyway, I wanted to get a wider berth of opinion, and something that would somewhat reflect the public, the consumers or the rejectors of news. Today, though, we're going to focus on really defining the press and news media, as well as its state in the present, in the form of its influence, and what it even looks like. I asked my many volunteers many questions in these interviews, and so the rest of the episode will be looking at 4 main issues or questions that I think really help to answer the bigger question of what is the press really. The first question then is quite simple from a quick glance. What comes to mind when you hear phrases such as the press or news media? But what I got from this question, which on the face of it looks very simple, is a wide range of answers. So let's hear some of them. We start off with some of the more general ideas of the press and news media regarding information.
Sort of information is the sort of tying term for me, but is current affairs, ongoing situations, information surrounding the world.
So I had a few. So obviously the first one I thought of is journalism, obviously. So looking at like different types of journalism, so either written or broadcast journalism. And I'm thinking, so branching off from that, thinking about the role of journalists, so looking at like the words like scrutiny, so being there to obviously scrutinize the decisions that government make. Democracy as well, of course. So the press being there in the first place, the role of the press is obviously indicative of having a democracy, and being able to have that freedom of speech, which is another thing I had in there as well.
I kind of think of it as any organisation that is talking about or discussing or imparting the latest sort of news and current affairs discussion. I suppose that's a way that I'd think about it.
But one thing noted about this role of information is that it's not just newspapers anymore. New media forms, and especially social media, were highlighted by a lot of the people I interviewed.
At the moment, there's a lot of very controversial political discourse happening, and I think the media is playing a big role in that. And I think initially you think kind of formal forms of media and press, kind of the typical newspapers, maybe news channels, radio. But I think increasingly now when I think about it, I think about social media and how people are using that as a form of sharing news, I suppose, beyond formal modes of communication.
If you'd said to me sort of when I was in primary school, what's the press sort of thing, I'd have probably said, newspapers that my dad picks up at the weekend or something like that. But now it's almost like newspapers, or at least in the physical format, have taken a bit of a a bit of a backseat, as it were, because there's so many other routes into media. By this I mean sort of I only have to flick onto Instagram or Twitter or something like that, and my feed is flooded with news articles and from blogs and websites and all sorts.
So you've got newspaper, sort of print media, and then also the sort of internet side of it. So you've got newspapers, news websites, news blogs, sort of those those emails you can sign up for that like send you the day's news each month, like each week or whatever. You can choose the frequency, I think. But that's immediately what kind of comes to mind. This huge variety of ways in which the news can be delivered to your doorstep.
And with that widening corpus of sources of news, we then started getting into some really nitty-gritty on where that role was being questioned by many of those that I interviewed.
I think the phrase that initially comes to mind is like, take it with a pinch of salt, because it is essentially made to sell. Their purpose is to sell newspapers or to get clicks and views. So it's always going to come with a flashy headline or a really sort of shocking statistic.
I think the first terms that come to mind are tricky and fine line. Anytime that you are representing any information, it gets very, very tricky. This is something that, having experience doing some news stuff with radio, primarily I've done entertainment work, so it's not really gotten into this space. You get into the tricky zone of Ofcom, maintaining balance, maintaining those different aspects, and with the different definitions people have for balance, with the different definitions people have for kind of what is objective, which is, ironic, it does get very, very tricky.
For me, my personal, I think, negative connotations have come with a lot of maybe, actually it's not that harsh to say, like bad journalism, right? Sort of a lot of bias in certain news outlets, and especially in the current political climate, it's very distressing to see, and a lot of current events I feel like are not adequately like reflected in big medias that I would usually follow, and I actually had to like push myself to find new media outlets that I can find information in.
News media. So when I think of news media, I always tag an extra word to it. Actually, I always tag industry. I always have to remember it's a business ultimately, and I don't believe that its intrinsic purpose necessarily is to inform people. I think that's something that it happens to do, but from what I see of a lot of news media, it's mainly to output content and to captivate people and to make people invested in certain ideas.
That was very much a key theme that we saw quite a lot in these interviews, was questions of bias and reliability in the press as a general theme. But the final key theme that was picked up on by a good few was the press as a form of invasion into the private lives of public figures through tabloid papers and sensationalist journalism.
The first thing that pops into my mind is sort of like, sort of like tabloid media, sort of really exaggerating the truths, skewing a lot of different perspectives in order to get a good headline and a good story.
Well, that's interesting. I think the first thing that comes to mind is probably the phone hacking scandal, and I'm not sure if this has just been in the news lately, but today I know there was the news about Prince Harry taking the press to court.
I think for me there's kind of two sides to it really. I see kind of social press and kind of news press. So when I think of social press, I think of kind of the paparazzi and the gossip press. So the kind of things that come to mind are kind of a lot of harassment, a lot of kind of issues with privacy complaints, that kind of stuff. With social press, I think I and possibly also British people as a whole think about things like Caroline Flack, for example.
So we see quite a lot there, and some very good examples were given. Henry, not their real name, brought up the phone hacking scandal, an older scandal in the UK, while George, not real name again, mentioned Caroline Flack's coverage in the news. I think that these two examples actually bring up a lot of the issues and themes highlighted by everyone else in this first question, so I'm going to quickly give a brief explanation of both. The phone hacking scandal reached its peak in 2011 after years of the lives of celebrities and other public figures were being revealed in ways that were illegal, with the Metropolitan Police investigating this from at least 1999. Now, it must be said that this practice of hacking the phones of public figures was not confined to one newspaper or media source. However, one name is particularly associated with this scandal: the News of the World. The staff of the News of the World, owned at the time by Rupert Murdoch as part of the larger Murdoch Press, were investigated for the alleged hacking of the phones of public figures, celebrities and politicians, and taking their voicemails and using it for their reporting. A notable case was the then royal editor for the News of the World, Clive Goodman, whose reports on members of the royal family, especially reporting on sensitive medical matters regarding Prince William, raised suspicions of where he was actually getting this information from. He was arrested in 2006, pled guilty to intercepting phone messages, and was jailed in 2007 for 4 months. By 2011, News of the World was implicated in a habit of phone hacking for its reports, and Murdoch had the News of the World shut down, ending a printing run of 168 years. That same year, the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee reported that a number around 12,800 people were affected or were victims of phone hacking by news media groups. This culture of phone hacking came predominantly from the need within news organisations to get the biggest scoop on public lives for mainly their gossip columns. That idea of sensationalism and celebrity reporting is mainly housed under the sort of catch-all term of tabloid journalism, especially in what we in the UK would call the red tops: The Sun, the Daily Star, the Daily Mirror, etc. The example given by George of Caroline Flack, though, is a more recent example of tabloid coverage of the lives of public figures, and this one had very dire consequences. I'm now going to place a content warning here for the next couple of minutes, as we will now be briefly discussing suicide. If you feel that you need to skip this part of the episode, please feel free to do so, and fast forward to 19 minutes 58. Caroline Flack was a famous TV show host, known for her time spent hosting UK staples such as X Factor and Love Island, but also for winning another UK staple, Strictly Come Dancing. Flack unfortunately died in 2020, having taken her own life while at the same time awaiting trial for an alleged assault. From what has been understood in the years afterwards, involving what occurred in the weeks and months leading up to her death, blame has been thrown around, not only at the Crown Prosecution Service's handling of the case, but also social media and the press, notably the tabloids. Negative coverage of Flack, especially with that awaiting trial, was pervasive in tabloids, especially The Sun and the Daily Star, and it merely added further fuel to Flack's portrayal in the public mind, which was then even more virulent on social media. To quote CNN's report on this, quote, "The same media cycle that aided Flack's rise to fame was condemned for tearing her down in her final months, and many reacted with fury as tabloids like The Sun moved swiftly to delete previous negative articles about the star." End quote. Caroline Flack's case is one of a litany of examples of celebrities and public figures targeted by the tabloid press, fueling sensationalism and taking advantage of scandal in people's lives. In the years since her death, there have been proposals for what has become known as Caroline's Law, which proposes to have media corporations be held to the standard of corporate manslaughter, and make it a criminal offence for the media to target people in their reports up to the point of someone taking their own life. So to move from those two case studies that we brought up, we see actually many of the themes discussed in that first question being pulled together. A press which dives into the privacy of public figures for consumption by the daily reader. The depressing thing about it, though, is it sells. The tabloids take up a significant part of the market share of newspapers, and this focus on public lives is one of the notable aspects of the tabloid press. But these actually highlight the larger themes spoken about by everyone that I interviewed. The press is still a form of information spreading even in these examples. There's a duty to report on events, but it's now being discussed outside of traditional forms of media, discussion on social media included. But then questions of how the press is using that power and position to report and spread information is one of the most critical questions we have about what has become known as the fourth estate. The microcosm of tabloid sensationalism actually encompasses all of these factors, but is also just one part of an ever-expanding press which fills those characterizations. The spread of information and how that information is then angled and portrayed in reporting. From there, though, we move on to whether those themes of information spreading and reliability or bias are actually new or more recent phenomena, which leads into my second question that I asked. Do you think that the press of the past in history reflects those words that you just used? Or do you think that the press has actually changed in the present day? And it's here that we saw a bit of a consensus in opinion in that the major change was actually the face of news media has significantly changed. 24/7 news, more sources of information, TV, radio, social media. It led into a question of who actually is the news nowadays? But the most significant topic discussed and agreed upon was that earlier concept of trust and reliability. They all agreed that trust, reliability, bias was a key problem with the press of today. But what was interesting is that we saw a divergence in opinion, in that some saw this as a newer or more pronounced issue with the press of the present day, whilst others saw it as the same old patter of news media.
I think it is similar. I think it must be the same, right? Because thinking about the past, there was a lot less information widely available. And if you go way back, most of the news was spread through the educated authorities and the elite who can sort of, influence populations and lower classes, which I think is still basically today what's happening.
I think it's quite different now. I think so. One thing that I was thinking about is looking at the lack of trust in the news nowadays compared to I think in the past, and that's sort of presenting a big problem to journalists, as example. Their job is sort of a lot more. I think it's changed quite a lot in the present day. So like I said, obviously the issue of ethical reporting and a sort of bias in the news. And I think a good example of this probably that I wrote down anyway is during Brexit. So a lot of the public sort of felt that they weren't presented with correct and balanced information about the pros and cons of leaving the European Union, and so essentially sort of voted blind.
If we go back all the way to Achaemenid Persia, or one of my favorite periods of history, a lot of the media, or their equivalent of media in that time, was primarily propaganda. If you look at something like the Cyrus cylinder, that there was inscribed after Cyrus took over Babylon, and it's essentially a big propaganda poster, but instead of poster, it's a carving in cuneiform, and it essentially talks about how Cyrus is the rightful ruler and he's been chosen by Marduk to be the liberator of Babylon. So going from there to the idea of a town crier, in a more like medieval era, somebody that'd be hollering the news on the street, something like that. I'd say that a lot of these have further incentives behind them than to inform, and a lot of them come with sort of inherent biases.
I think it should be noticed as like the press, from my experience, because my research area is more towards the 20th century, 21st century for my work, and you can see a massive change of the sensationalization of the press. So things like paparazzi, things like celebrity stories, and focus on people's lives is massively emphasized in a lot of press. Whereas I think in the past it's been a more authoritative readership, where the stuff you're getting told by the news before kind of the invention of the internet and before the invention of things like gossip columns and things like that, it's a very much different type of readership.
I think that I'd say that there's probably no point in time where the media and press aren't involved in some sort of controversy of people accusing them of leaning towards one way or the other. So I think that aspect remains the same. I think just because of technology advancements, the form of it has changed.
I think this discussion of bias, reliability, trust, however you want to phrase it, can be encapsulated into one term that has become so common in the last decade. Probably because of one man.
I'd like to welcome the fake news media, which is back there.
Ah yes, fake news. The connoisseur's choice. The term that everyone has heard and hates all the same. This comes alongside so many other terms. Dishonest reporting, sensationalism, disinformation and misinformation. But the term fake news has really stuck in the last 10 years, especially with the rise of Donald Trump. And that is weird to me. Political scientists have referred to the age of post-truth politics since the 1980s. But this has become even more pronounced now with recent populist politicians, populism itself not being a new phenomenon either. Elijah there referred to the Brexit debate of 2016, where people felt the news media didn't give a full image of the consequences of that decision. But this was also thrown at politicians as well. The famous images of Boris Johnson in front of a bus quoting an extra £350 million a week for the NHS, or Nigel Farage making a banner very shortly before the vote implying migrants and refugees coming to Britain was a threat to attract anti-immigrant and xenophobic sentiment, especially Islamophobic. Those are just two examples that I picked because they were the most well-known ones. There were so many other claims, half-truths and lies that no voter could reasonably be expected to have fact-checked everything quick enough for that vote. And I'd really recommend Tim Shipman's book, All Out War, for a more overall look at this campaign, all the behind the scenes, and things that you may have forgotten even happened during that referendum. It's a really interesting and captivating read. But it remains to be said that the issue of reliability and bias is not new. I think that the issue is just more pronounced, with more and faster ways to communicate with a larger group of people who are asking the exact same questions. Brexit, Trump, and other recent political issues are just more examples of a consistent pattern. In my own historical research, as is going to be shown further throughout the series, even in my period of study, 1780 to 1830, you had clear political divides and biases in the newspaper and pamphlets, which were being commented on by the opposing sides of the debate. They were calling each other out for base lies or political brainwashing of the population in a very charged political time. The issue of reliability in journalism and news coverage has always been there. It's just become a lot louder in the present, with its visibility being even larger with the internet. But then we move on to another part of the present news media, its global nature. This is something I really wanted to pick apart, as this is another phenomenon which needs some debunking. The idea that international news is a new thing is simply not the case. It has just gotten more pervasive. So I asked the people I interviewed, how global would you say the media is in the past and present? Is there a difference there as well to you? And everyone had agreement that the media is global these days, and that one of the big differences is not the case that flows of world or international news existed at all, but that the speed with which we get international news today has sped up dramatically, especially with the advent of new media forms.
I think global news has existed for as long as we've been able to transport information across the world. So that can be when it took like months to travel, and then now in the instantaneous digital age, there has been this fascination going back. I think the difference now is availability and accessibility of this information.
It feels like a more recent phenomenon. I was thinking about how, well, just this morning, I went onto TikTok. The first video I saw was a clip from the Republican presidential debate. So American news. I know through the voice referendum in Australia, I was getting TikToks about the voice.
I think it's fair to say that there has been in the past, but just not at the speed that it's happening now. I mean, if you think about it, people say, you brought up different types of media. I mean, 24-hour media, but also social media. People say, oh, Twitter is not the news and TikTok is not the news, but to a lot of people it is. It is the news, and this is immediate direct information. Anyone can tweet and anyone can upload a video to TikTok, right? I mean, of course, this comes into play, like, is this true or is it not true? And fact-checking and just spread of misinformation in general on those sources. But certainly, I think global news is not necessarily such a new thing, but the rate it's happening at and the fact that it's so visual as well, right?
This is important. New media formats are bringing news to the public faster and in larger quantities than ever before. But there was a caveat raised by some. The international news, to them, is still selective.
But it's a sort of global world we're living in. And it's a daft phrase, but we're all interconnected. But the one thing I will lump in here, even as I say, oh, there's global news happening, we're more connected to news happening all across the world, that I've never been to Asia or anything like that, but I still get news about what's happening there. I still think there is very much a America-Europe focus in this kind of news.
I think the press that we get about different parts of the world, it's very much that if there's a public outcry or if it's a big thing in people's minds, then they will really focus reporting on it. But if not, it will sort of quietly go unnoticed. I think especially with noticing stuff for the BBC, like the war in Ukraine and the things that are happening in Israel and Palestine right now, that's getting a lot of attention because there's a lot of outcry about it in the public. But I think, especially with the things that have occurred in the Ukraine, that the information and the attention put on that very much died down once it stopped being a very huge spike in public outcry and it sort of disappeared a little bit. Because I think once the larger, the sort of general public started to care a little bit less, it sort of got dropped because people weren't going to be clicking on the articles a little bit. Because the one thing that I can say is a bit of a personal thing, when the Sri Lankan Civil War was occurring, my parents would never look at the BBC News for that because that was sort of not really mentioned, and it was always a Tamil news site or a Sri Lankan news channel that had more focused or potentially a bit more accurate and less sensationalized coverage of it.
This is a very important point. As a global historian, I would talk a lot about flows of information across borders. In my research covering the years 1780 to 1830, I would be calling this by a different name. global flows of information across imperial networks, connecting colonies and the metropole. But those flows in that period are uneven and contested. Certain parts of the network are emphasized over others. And in the present, it is the same issue of uneven flows of information, just on a larger scale. As a quick thinking exercise, would you say you know what's going on in America? Yeah, you probably do. How about Ukraine? Yeah, you probably would say yes to that, seeing as it has had a decent amount of coverage in the news, but not as much as a couple of years ago. Okay, what about Chad or Mongolia? You probably know nothing. But guess what? On May the 6th, tomorrow when this episode is released, Chad is having its presidential election. Mongolia will be having their parliamentary elections next month. Why is it that we don't know anything happening there? Simply put, it's demand and interest. There is no interest for news of events in those countries, even though things are going on. And yes, I've picked 2 examples which support my point, but it speaks to a larger issue. Global media is, but it also isn't global media. It's global according to what matters to the news gatherer and to the consumer, what they deem important. That idea then changes in different parts of the world, and also with political ideology. And that choice of what is important and not important brings up the final question I want to raise in this episode. Definitely one of the biggest questions I had. The question of influence. I asked, what influence would you say the press has on how politics and the world are framed in general? And goodness me, we got some very interesting answers here. Everyone agreed on the impact on the general public and how they see things from news sources.
I thought this was a really interesting question. I think it's a massive influence. Like, if you think about, like, from TV programs like The Kardashians or The Crown, for example, like, even in those examples, you see every single time something happens, it's how's this going to be portrayed in the press? How do we want this to be spun to the press? They've got press offices, they've got people, how they choose to disseminate information, things like press conferences. I think press is so important. It's like, imagine like the playground gossip. It is that, but magnified to a global scale.
Well, I think answering those questions does slightly depend on how you define the press. If we go by my definition that I sort of gave earlier, where almost it feels like anybody with a social media account can form part of this wider press, the wider press, then I think it's an absolutely huge influence, because I mean, all it takes, people scrolling late at night through social media, they'll come across multiple articles, and just the sheer volume of news that you can receive, I think it necessarily means that you're not going to take a critical approach to the way that you think about every bit of news, because you just simply don't have enough time in the day to go, oh, what kind of source is giving me this news? Should I trust it? Are there reasons to doubt it? If you do that on every single post that you come across, you'll be exhausted. There's no chance you're going to get up in the morning to go to work.
The examples given were wide-ranging, but also, when we get into the minutiae of what they all said, you see how that impact has wide-ranging implications. Firstly, in politics.
Any story, any large story, will be covered by the big main journals. I don't need to name them all, but so the Times, the Guardian, the Sun, all of them will cover it. There won't be a big story and the writers of the Sun will go, oh no, we can't cover that, that's not, no, we can't. They have a massive writers pool, they have someone who'll cover it. But in the particular framing of that story, you'll read a story that's going on, and the coverage in the Sun, and the coverage in the Guardian, and the coverage in the Telegraph and the Times will be framed differently. Same fundamental story of, I'm a scientist, so I'm just going to say X is happening. But in terms of the framing and the wording and the interviews, they will shift it to shift public perception of their readership.
I think it's huge. I think if you look in the UK, you really struggle to find the last time the newspapers backed someone to win an election who didn't win that election. And the fact that, I can't remember what his name is. Maybe the Murdochs or someone along those lines. They have a party and every year, and all the politicians go to it to win favour. And the fact that you have to court those sort of news institutions is really interesting. I mean, the fact that Lord Lebedev was bought the Evening Standard, big supporter of Boris Johnson, and is now, I think, the Lord of Siberia or something in the House of Lords. I think you can sort of see the interconnections between politicians and the media.
But especially in echo chambers.
I think it does have a sway on the way that we consume our information, but I think the press's power is only because of the people who read it and their perceptions of what information is. I feel like if you think that any information you get is gospel and it's completely infallible, then it will always be taken properly and without question. Whereas if you question what you read and the motivations behind it, and where have these companies got their funding from, where are their interests lying, where is their readership lying, I feel like we'll get into a very different way of the press influencing how we think about current issues.
But people become very stuck in their views. I feel like it becomes a lot harder to have a conversation with anyone with different views than yours, because it feels right now that, especially the way media is now, you can get very stuck with one specific media, essentially, or a group, of media basically telling you in some way what to think, right?
Those are the three key takeaways I got from the question of influence. Massive influence. That influence being inescapable with the growth in presence of the press, news media, and the new kid on the block in social media, bringing it closer to your life. Like, can't I just do a quick scroll of Instagram or Twitter where I can just laugh at some memes without something news related or what's going on in politics showing up on my feed? And that influence's implications were the other two takeaways. A fundamental question in political science is everything politics? All of our own actions, are they all inherently political? In reading the news and media, it seems to be a much easier yes. Influence on how you vote from what you read, what angle it takes, and how it implicitly influences how you see things. But that then gets us to the third takeaway. How that then has the possibility of pushing you into polarized confirmation bias and echo chambers. Do you choose to consume the media you do because it actually just confirms your own view of things? Or is it that those sources dragged you in and made you think that way? It's certainly an interesting question, one which I'm still grappling with when I consider what I read and how I interact with politics and the news, even in my own research and how I analyse and judge things I read in newspapers from the early 19th century. But the weird thing to pick up is that for me, it seems the political biases in those newspapers are more obvious to me. Possibly because I'm detached from the daily life of those reading it. And since we're in the present day, present news reporting is harder to detach yourself from because you're experiencing it as well as reading, watching, listening to it. Consciously or subconsciously, we're all emotionally invested. So, where does this all leave us? We see a present day press that is confusing to define, which some say is the same as it was in many ways, and others saying it has changed markedly. A press which has influence, or maybe we influence it by just confirming our own biases, which is global and also isn't at the same time. I think it reveals the complexity of the news and press media historically, but also in the present. I said in the first episode that politics is everywhere and is inescapable. And the same is true of the press. You can't escape its influence. It's everywhere. And it's not confined to the pages of newspapers anymore. It's nowadays on your TV, on your radio, in the podcasts you listen to. I'm definitely not part of the problem there, am I? But it's even on your social media pages, with your doom scrolling feeding the algorithm to give you more from formal and informal news sources. It makes it harder to see what's news, what's opinion, and what's in between. It's become a lot more blurred. Everything's rather confusing, right? I want to end this episode by identifying one of the people I interviewed. Noah. Noah is a good friend of mine from my undergraduate days of university. He's not what I would deem to be a general member of the public that consumes media and news. He actually works in journalism. He works for Politico Europe as a reporter and has done so for over a year now. His interview was the most eye-opening for me on these questions. Our chat lasted many hours and he gave really good insights into the press and news media from the perspective of a young journalist. And his most impactful statement, when I was listening back and taking further notes, came from that first question. When I asked him about defining news media, he said this.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question in which to start, because we hear that term used all the time. The press is praised or criticised or derided, and the role in which media plays in our society is seen as kind of so overwhelming. The fact, we have access to media on our phones and our pockets 24 hours a day, and especially when contrast to more, old-fashioned ways of accessing media, where it was just in newspapers or even in sort of more recent times, only on the television, and then you could, never catch up with news media afterwards. You were either watching it when it went out live on the TV or you'd missed it. So I suppose in my mind I'm sort of in a contradiction in a way, because I'm thinking of both the historic old-fashioned, quite literal printing presses when you mention the press, but also the very modern ways in which people can access information, even through platforms like TikTok, which I don't know how to use, but know that that is a way in which information, both truthful and obviously more worryingly factually incorrect, can be spread. I think the media is incredibly exciting. It can be amazing when you see whether it's a TV channel saying they've broken an exclusive or a newspaper breaking an exciting exclusive story. But with that desire to come first and be the first one with the story must be overriding with that, the desire to be right. There's no use being first and then finding out, I actually got that information wrong, because then you've got egg on your face. Obviously, quite literally, if it's in a newspaper or even in a TikTok video or a tweet that can be taken down, well, it's very easy for those things to be screenshotted and that's there forever. So the media is, it's a form of great excitement, but given the amount of access that it has, it should be treated and used with a great deal of responsibility too.
Now, some may see this as mere fence-sitting from a journalist, but I think it reveals something else. It's nuanced, both his opinions and the news media itself. It gets praise and just criticism, but I think that comment really gets into the complexity of this topic, and how our views of things are very much shaped not only by things like media and the news, but also everyday life and our established political thinking. The way we see the world will affect how and whether we criticise or praise something. The politics of the issue can't be escaped, but the politics of the individual and the group can completely change the view and angle of something. Tone, words, what is included, what isn't. It shows the press as a complex Frankenstein's monster of differing opinions, formats and voices, which doesn't conform to one definition or way of thinking regarding it. So, do we actually get anywhere by looking at the press and news media as a whole? Is it too complex? Too expansive? Too vague? I think in some respect it is, and needs refinement to look at specifics. Say, a specific political outlook within the press, wink wink nudge nudge, tune into next episode. But we shouldn't forget that specific formats within a news media or a specific outlook is actually part of this larger vague conglomerate, and is continually responding to and antagonizing other parts and outlooks within it. That's what we should remember when we focus more on the right-wing and right-wing press throughout this series, how it works within the larger whole. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Same Old News. Next episode, we're going to dig deeper into the news and look specifically at the right-wing version of it, which also needs a definition. What do we even mean by right-wing? If you enjoyed this episode of Same Old News, please consider giving us a follow where you're listening, and also check out our social media accounts in the description for updates and other news. We're on Instagram and Twitter, that's at same_old_news for Twitter, and at same__old_news on Insta. But other than that, I hope you all have a great day, and I will see you again sometime soon for the Same Old News. Thanks for listening.